Merci bien. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis honoré que vous m'avez choisi, un journaliste anglophone, pour vous parler aujourd'hui. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Bill Hoagland. I started my 45-year-long career with CFCF Television, now CTV Montreal, of course, in 1961. I had just graduated from a course in broadcasting from Ryerson Institute of Technology in Toronto. And this is going to be a brag on my part, but there was 100 students involved, and I came in the top 10. The CAB, that was the host of this particular course in Ryerson, sent background reports on all of the top 10 people to virtually every radio and television station in the country, giving them reasons why we should be hired. And that's how I landed the job at CFCF Radio, at the incredible salary of $35 a week. How times have changed. CFCF Montreal did not come into existence, CTV Montreal, until about 4 years after my job at radio. So in 1964, everybody who'd worked in radio moved uptown to the new, brand spanking new headquarters of CFCF Television. And it was a real learning experience for me, because I had to hold 2 microphones all of a sudden for every news assignment that I went to. One was for radio, one was for television. And I say it was a learning experience because, you know, in radio, you can write your script out on a piece of paper and then you just read it into a microphone. Not so with television. You had to have a sort of eye-and-eye contact with the viewer. So, you know, you wanted to maintain that personal connection as much as you possibly could. And I learned how to ad-lib, but I also did a little cheating. Now I'm going to show you something. Suppose this is the microphone, my thumb, in my left hand. And I would go blah, 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 and do the first part of my report, talk for maybe 20 seconds or so. And then I would look down at the meaty part of the palm of my hand where I had written 4 crib notes. 1-word crib notes that would give me the name of an individual, the name of an organization, possibly an issue that I wanted to talk about. And I'd carry on for another 20, 25 seconds. So I cheated. You know, at no time in those days did I ever find any kind of, I don't know, tension between Francophone and Anglophone reporters. We were all in the same business. And after all, we're still in the same business, trying to get the news out every day to our news consumers. I've always had a personal philosophy, and that is, it's an old philosophy, live and let live, when it comes to everyone in the province of Quebec, be they Francophone, Anglophone, or Allophone. In the 1960s, for example, if I were to go to a news conference a little bit late, I'd walk over and talk to a Francophone journalist and say, what did I miss? Because, you know, I didn't want to look like an idiot when I finally did an interview and needed relevant questions for the hosts of that press conference. And if somebody else was late and I had arrived on time, I'd return the favor. It was a question then of simple cooperation and friendship. I had the privilege during that period of doing a weekly interview with a man called Pierre Elliott Trudeau. We used to meet every Wednesday at noon, and this would be in the lobby of the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in downtown Montreal. We would then move into what was called the ballroom in those days, and I don't know whether that ballroom still exists just off the lobby. And we'd sit at a table, and Mr. Trudeau invited me to ask him any question involving any aspect of life in Canada or life in the province of Quebec. He was a member of Parliament then, and I don't think he had ever publicly announced his interest in becoming the Prime Minister of Canada one day. I also did weekly interviews with Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau and his Executive Committee Chairman, Lucien Saunier, and again, any question was acceptable. So we talked about crime in Montreal, housing shortages, homeless people. Even back in those days, there were homeless people. And of course, plans that were still on paper for the 1967 World's Fair. It was a time of mutual respect, in my experience, between all of us journalists. And Quebecers, virtually of all cultures, got along just fine. I regularly interviewed René Lévesque in his very small office, which was located somewhere in the Montreal's northeast end, I think, Saint Gregoire Street, something like that. Anyway, Mr. Lévesque had books from floor to ceiling on all four walls of that tiny office. He had books on politics, books on philosophy, books on religion, books on psychology. You have a question about any issue known to mankind, and M. Lévesque had a book for that. I'll never forget the time when the yes vote lost the first Quebec referendum. Mr. Lévesque was not angry. He was not vindictive when he stepped forward and bowed his head slightly and walked over to the news camera and said, "À la prochaine." I don't think this man of passion ever gave up his dreams, even to the very point of his passing away. When FLQ bombs were exploding in the streets of Montreal, when Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte's body was found in the trunk of that car, when British diplomat James Cross was abducted by the FLQ and held in a very small enclosure in a building in Montreal North area, I was standing on a hill just outside that building on the day that Cross was released by the FLQ. The FLQ members who had kidnapped him, basically, walked right past me to a helicopter that landed about 50 yards away from me. They were taken to Dorval Airport for a safe passage voyage aboard a commercial airliner to Cuba. And that was their deal with the authorities. They would release Cross. They would get a safe passage to Cuba. Now, this might sound like a kind of an irresponsible question, an irresponsible point of view. But it was a very exciting time to be a reporter in the city of Montreal in the province of Quebec. I used to follow the bomb squad with the Montreal police every day. And you know, it was one of those situations where if a bomb was found unexploded, two guys dressed in an armored costume with a very solid face mask would lift that unexploded device into a padded truck, a specially built padded truck. And then the padded truck would be driven with all of us news guys chasing afterwards to an empty parking lot behind Montreal City Hall, and with the cameras rolling, whump, that would be exploded. You know, being a reporter like this is a very responsible job. You don't want to pick sides when you're covering a story. You want your opinion to be kept to yourself. Nobody wants to hear what we think of an issue, unless it's a clearly defined editorial comment. My boss in those days was a man named Bert Cannings, who came to Montreal out of the print media in British Columbia. And he was a typical, almost a 1950s Bogart movie character. Always had a big long cigar in his mouth, and he was always probably the best teacher that anyone could possibly hope to have. Whenever we did a report, whatever that report might be, Bert would take it privately into the editing suite and screen it for himself, after which he would call you into his office and he'd critique the report. Great learning experience. One day, he sent me downtown Montreal to St. Catherine Street to do what we used to call a streeter. Now, this is when you held a microphone on the street, on a sidewalk, let's say St. Catherine Street, and you do random interviews with people passing by about any number of issues. This, though, was a specific assignment by Mr. Cannings. He wanted me to interview U.S. draft dodgers who'd come to Montreal in large numbers to avoid having to fight in the Vietnam War. I did manage to find half a dozen of these guys wandering around on St. Catherine Street. I did the interview with all of them. And then I went back to the station, and I worked with a film editor to put together, and I say film editor because in those days it wasn't video, to put together a long report, 2.5 minutes. Cannings liked to have only a 1.5, 2-minute report. Figured 2.5 minutes was too long. He was probably right. Then he called me into his office, and I thought he's going to praise me because that was a good report. And I was surprised to find he had a very red face, and he seemed very angry at me. And he said, "Haughland, I know what you think about the Vietnam War. I should not know what you think about the Vietnam War, and as a result, this report, as good as it is, will not be on Pulse News tonight." Believe me, I never forgot that lesson. And I've always, as a reporter, kept my opinion to myself. When our son Hugh Haughland, a CTV national cameraman, died, covering in a helicopter the aftermath of a tornado that swept through in the Laurentian foothills. Something went wrong with the helicopter mechanically, and it swung over and hit a high-tension wire and flipped upside down. Thankfully, my son was killed instantly. There was no suffering involved. But at that point, you know, I kind of figured life is too short for any of us who walk the streets today to be angry at each other, to be hateful of each other for political reasons. We can all still be friends. I want to thank Stéphane Giroux in particular for helping me put this all together today, and for all of my friends and former colleagues at CTV Montreal. I'd also like to thank Martine Desjardins of the FPJQ. She was very helpful in helping everybody else do what we have done today. Enjoy your event, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Merci, merci, merci.